as I mentioned, is available on the conference website. So I hope you enjoy it. Let us then begin with a face that should be familiar to all of you. Most Adventists today know the story of how Joseph Bates, in response to a dream he had in July of 1849, took the stagecoach up Route 12 to Jackson, Michigan, and persuaded blacksmith Dan Palmer, his wife Abigail, and about 20 other former Millerites in the area to keep the seventh-day Sabbath. It is a thrilling story of God's leading in the life of a man whose incessant travels in New England would increase the number of Sabbatarian Advent believers from 400 in 1849 to 2,500 by 1851, and in New York from 20 in 1849 to over 1,000 in 1852. But there is one question that nobody asks about this story. Where was Bates coming from when he took that stagecoach to Jackson, Michigan? The answer is Indiana, and specifically South Bend, Indiana. So in reality, the Advent movement in the Midwest began in Indiana, not in Jackson or Battle Creek, Michigan. And yet Bates wasn't having much success in South Bend for one very simple reason. 7 years earlier, in November of 1842, Father Edward Sorin of the Congregation of the Holy Cross and 7 Roman Catholic priests had established a mission there, and in 1844 had started a seminary. Soon this seminary became a college, and eventually, as you know, the University of Notre Dame, that attracted scores of young Catholic men who poured into a town of 1,000 citizens that included only 20 Catholic families. This resulted in anti-Catholic tension in South Bend, and that was not a healthy climate for Adventist evangelism. And so God directed Bates in a dream to go to Jackson and to establish the oldest continuously meeting Sabbath-keeping Adventist congregation in the world, which this year is 173 years old. Yet far from abandoning Indiana, Bates would return to the state many times in the 1850s. In July of 1850, he and Abraham Dodge preached in the Kingsbury and LaPorte areas, where their message converted Joseph and Jasmine Catlin, C-A-T-L-I-N, the first Hoosier converts to Sabbatarian Adventism. 2 months later, Samuel Rhodes and John Bowles also held meetings in LaPorte and Kingsbury. In the fall of 1851, there we go, the young John Nevins Andrews labored across northern Indiana. And then in May of 1852, Joseph Wagner hiked 50 miles to bring the truth to lay preacher J.M. Stevenson of San Jacinto. And a month later, Hiram Case held evangelistic meetings there as well. Soon, Stevenson, with Wagner's encouragement, became a zealous preacher of gospel truth in southern Indiana. Bates returned in the summer of 1852 and again in the fall of 1853, bringing with him the novice preachers John Loughborough and Merritt Cornell, whose peripatetic ministry included Michigan, Illinois, and Wisconsin. Bates led an Advent conference, that is a general meeting of believers in a particular area, at Oswego, at which M.P. Chaplin subscribed to the New Advent Review and Sabbath Herald. By the mid-1850s, the scattered saints were being encouraged to attend these conferences. Loughborough and Cornell led 2 of them at Kingsbury and Salem Center in August of 1853. Joseph Bates led another one at Sullivan in October before going to Lawrenceburg to lecture to 40 listeners on Advent beliefs in the county courthouse, assisted by local Adventist William Gould and R. Moran. After what he described as a toilsome journey of 2 days and 2 nights, Bates reached Sullivan, where an attentive audience packed the courthouse to hear his lectures. Going a bit too fast here. Are you sure we're in the right? We're supposed to be in the 1850s. I think we're way, way ahead of ourselves here. I'm sorry. I'm looking for J.B. Frisbee to come up on the screen, and we're not there, Caleb. We need to get back in the 1850s. Sorry about that. We have a great. There's Frisbee. Okay. J.B. Frisbee and J. Catlin, meanwhile, preached in Salem, where they had a free time and where their message awakened a deep interest, resulting in the first 3 baptisms in the state. By the end of the decade, these 9 preachers began to harvest some spiritual fruit. Joel and Lydia Locke and 7 others in Salem became Sabbath-keeping Adventists in 1853, thanks to the preaching of Loughborough and Cornell, who rejoiced to find them still faithful when they returned to the area in the fall of 1857. But these wide-ranging, circuit-riding preachers seldom preached in the same place every year. When Bates returned in 1858, it had been 5 years since he held meetings in Indiana. In January, he preached in private homes in a public hall in LaPorte, after which he baptized 8 souls in a nearby river in the midst of winter. And yes, they had to break the ice, literally. He then traveled 10 miles south to Stillwell Prairie before returning to lecture in the schoolhouse at LaPorte in July, after which he baptized Brother Harvey before going on to North Liberty. Meanwhile, a recent Illinois convert, Moses Hull, whose mother lived in Roosevelt, Indiana, I believe I pronounced that correctly by Hoosier standards. Up in Michigan, we'd say Russiaville. Okay, Roosevelt began preaching gospel truth in that area in the fall of 1858. In a December 23, 1858 article entitled Charity at Home in the Review, he pleaded with believers to be generous in their support of traveling Adventist ministers. He said that he had received $1,000 a year in God bless yous and praise the Lord's, but very little in actual cash. May the Lord root covetousness out from among us, he exclaimed. Systematic benevolence and early tithing plan for supporting the ministry were still 1 year away in the future. Shortly thereafter, Joseph Wagner joined Hull in Roosevelt to hold public evangelistic meetings in the Disciples of Christ Church, which resulted in 8 baptisms, again in a nearby frozen pond. As the decade came to a close, in 1859, Loughborough preached in LaPorte and North Liberty in April. Wagner also held meetings in the schoolhouse at LaPorte every night for a week with good results, despite the fact that his listeners sat for 2 hours every evening on rude, uncomfortable seats. Hull's sustained witness in Roosevelt and North Liberty also reaped 9 converts that spring. Weeks later, he was joined by Loughborough, who stayed for a month this time, preaching in North Liberty at the Baptist Church in Sumption's Prairie and at nearby Morris. Elder Loughborough, who was good at thinking on his feet, also started something brand new in Indiana, a question and answer session following his lengthy lectures, during which he usually was able to answer every question with Bible texts. Perhaps it might be helpful if I said something about transportation in Indiana in the 1850s. First of all, the dirt roads were terrible. In the spring, they became quagmires, a foot or more deep in mud, which often prevented horse-drawn wagons and buggies from getting through. In summer and fall, they were rutted and choked with dust. In the winter, they were often covered with deep snowdrifts. so that the only way Adventists could get to meetings was by cutter, sleigh, or walking. Furthermore, many of the old plank roads here in Indiana, they were called corduroy roads, were made by placing split logs flat sides down and filling in the gaps with dirt and gravel. This picture is of a corduroy road. Many of these plank roads also charged tolls, and since there was no such thing as Easy Pass, one had to pay cash. Not many railroad lines traversed the state until the 1860s, although a few crisscrossed northern Indiana in the 1850s, including the Pennsylvania and Indiana Railroad and the New Albany and Salem Railroad. As late as 1859, Elder Wagner, then holding meetings in Plymouth, remarked, "The state of Indiana's roads has somewhat diverted us from our course. We go where we can, and we cannot go where we would." That would be a frequent refrain of traveling Adventist preachers for many years to come. As if the roads themselves were not bad enough, the peripatetic preachers in Indiana also faced strong opposition in the 1850s. The mainline churches, particularly the Presbyterians, Methodists, Episcopalians, and Disciples of Christ, often locked their doors and forbade Adventist ministers to preach from their pulpits. Even those Sunday-keeping ministers who initially welcomed Adventist lecturers often shunned them once they started preaching about the Sabbath, the state of the dead, and the perpetuity of God's law. This is why our evangelists had to hold meetings in private homes, rural schoolhouses, and public halls until well into the 1870s, when Adventists began building their own meeting houses. Occasionally, even in a nation that was avowedly Protestant and Christian, evangelists faced what they called infidelity, by which they meant either agnostic or atheistic beliefs. Lay preacher J.M. Stevenson met atheists in San Jacinto and across southern Indiana in 1853, a region close to Kentucky, where many of the hillbilly folk down there seldom attended church at all. Likewise, Adventist preachers frequently face slander and name-calling. Because of their Sabbath-keeping habits, Midwesterners often called them Jews. And because Adventism was an American-born religion, like the Latter-day Saints, citizens sometimes labeled them Mormons, and that was not a complimentary term. Not to be outdone, however, Adventists occasionally assigned labels to their opponents. William Gould of Lawrenceburg called them ravening wolves who dwelt in this Sodom of a place. Almon Chafee of Salem dubbed them the dragon voice. During the 1850s, some parts of Indiana were strongholds of spiritualism as well. Given the fact that Adventists held distinctly different views of human nature, death, and the afterlife than spiritualists did, clashes were inevitable. In 1858, Joseph Bates debated with spiritualists in Stillwell Prairie and LaPorte. In the latter town, he also had to deal with what he called some lawless and disorderly elements, or dissidents, who were trying to distract other believers from the truth. In Roosevelt, Moses Hull crossed swords with a group of age-to-come fanatics who opposed God's Ten Commandment law and believed in a second probation for everyone in the future. Moreover, they did not hold family worship. They opposed public prayers, and many of them used tobacco. Finally, wherever Adventist evangelists went, they faced Sunday-keeping ministers who were eager to engage them in protracted debates on the seventh-day Sabbath, the state of the dead, and the perpetuity of God's law. Such debates, which often lasted for several days or even weeks, had both benefits and drawbacks. On the positive side, Adventist preachers often convinced listeners of gospel truth and won converts to the cause. On the negative side, such lengthy confrontations exhausted the ministers, distracted them from their evangelistic focus, induced pride and egoism in some, and engendered bitter feelings among their opponents, as we will see in subsequent chapters. Because there were no organized Seventh-day Adventist congregations in Indiana between 1850 and 1860, converts usually kept the Sabbath all by themselves, with their families or with a handful of scattered believers who happened to live nearby. Naturally, their isolation induced loneliness, longing, and sometimes discouragement. But their letters to the Review also mirror their hopes, expectations, and firm belief in the truth. Certainly one of the loneliest of saints was William Gould, the only Adventist in Lawrenceburg, a town of 5,000 inhabitants. He wrote often of the trials and persecutions he faced, as all alone he tried to witness to his neighbors. Frequently he expressed the hope that church leaders would send a minister to preach in his town. "I am in a lonely place here," he wrote in January of 1856, "where we have no preaching. The paper," referring to the Review, "is the only medium by which I can hear from those of precious faith." The following year, he begged for the prayers of the dear brethren and sisters to sustain me in this Sodom of a place, where his neighbors looked at him as a very wicked person. In fact, they considered him an infidel or atheist for working on the first day of the week. Nonetheless, in 1858, he was determined by the help of God to press on in the cause of truth. So eager was Perrin Scarborough of Bigelow's Mills to hear good Adventist preaching that he offered free lodging and food at his Pilgrim's home to any minister who came to Haskell's Corners on the New Albany and Salem Railroad. Over in Curryville, John Davis made the same offer twice in November and December of 1856, when he begged Review editor Uriah Smith, shown here with his wife Harriet, to send a preaching brother to nearby Sullivan, where some of our friends wished to know of the faith which we set forth. His Adventist neighbor, Sister N. Guider, made the same plea the following year, when all alone with many trials, she asked for prayer that I may lay all on the altar of the Lord and cut loose from the world. In 1857, E.D. Place of LaPorte expressed the same sentiment, telling Smith that the few Adventists there pleaded for someone to come and preach. For like Simon the Tanner, we want the truth. Lydia Locke spoke for the lonely few, only 9 believers in Salem, in 1857, when she described a few here that are striving to overcome through the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. They had requested an Advent preacher for a long time, but have been disappointed thus far. And so she asked if James and Ellen White, this is the earliest photo we have of James and Ellen White, 1854 in Rochester, New York. She asked if James and Ellen White would come. Meanwhile, she was striving to be pure and holy in heart, and exhorted believers to be faithful and watch and pray always. Well, most Hoosier Adventists lived in isolated loneliness. A few banded together for prayer meetings, Sabbath worship services, and testimony sessions. And here is the very short list of those who did in the 1850s. As early as 1853, M.P. Chaplin referred to an Advent band meeting in Washington. Another humble, loving, commandment-keeping band that used to worship together in Oswego had sadly apostatized by 1853. The outlook was far brighter, however, in Salem in 1854, where 16 Adventists met every Sabbath in private homes to read the Review and the Use Instructor, and to pray together. 8 of them also met twice a week by 1859 for prayer meetings. Likewise, a tiny band of believers gathered in LaPorte, beginning in 1857. Most of them had been converted through reading Adventist literature, distributed by George Smith and Sister Place. Down in Roosevelt, a group of 8 Adventists met twice a week for prayer and on Sabbaths for Bible study classes, despite the jeering of their Christian neighbors. One of the largest gatherings, perhaps 10 to 15 believers, met at Brother Ezra Stiles' home at Crowns Point for prayer meetings every Sabbath. These scattered bands would form the nucleus of several future organized churches in the 1860s. And so, in conclusion, as we wrap up the 1850s, the overview of the rise of Sabbath-keeping Adventism in Indiana during the 1850s highlights several realities. First, none of the 11 ministers working in the state actually came from Indiana. 5 of them, C.W. Bowles, M.E. Cornell, H.S. Case, J.B. Frisbee, and Abraham Dodge, hailed from Michigan. Three of them, Samuel Rhodes, J.N. Andrews, and J.N. Loughborough, had been born and raised in New York. Joseph Bates came from Massachusetts, J.H. Wagner from Wisconsin, Moses Hall from Illinois. Not until the 1870s would Indiana have its own team of preachers. Secondly, preaching the third angel's message to Hoosiers was a very difficult task at first. Adventist ministers faced stiff opposition from the mainline churches, from spiritualists, and from age-to-come fanatics. They were often slandered as Jews and Mormons. Ministers of all denominations frequently challenged them to debates about the Sabbath, God's law, the state of the dead, which Adventist preachers always won those debates. Thirdly, throughout the 1850s, Advent believers were widely scattered throughout north and central Indiana. Their letters to the Review frequently expressed their loneliness, their longings, their discouragement, but also their hopes, their expectations, and their firm belief in gospel truth. Fourthly, while no organized churches yet existed, tiny bands of between 6 and 15 Advent believers coalesced in such places as Washington, Oswego, Salem, LaPorte, Roosevelt, and Crowns Point. 3 of these bands would eventually organize into churches in the 1860s. And so we move now to the 1860s, the active saints. During the 1860s, a growing number of preachers took the message of the 3 angels of Revelation 14 into new areas of the state. All of the ordained ministers came from outside of Indiana. Bates, Byington, Canright, and Lane from Michigan, Wagner and Ingram from Wisconsin, and Hull from Illinois. But in 1862, a man from North Liberty named Ezra Stiles, S-T-Y-L-E-S, became the first Hoosier lay preacher in the state. A name to remember, Ezra Stiles. During the winter of 1859 and 60, Joseph H. Wagner preached in South Milford, staying only one day, despite the fact that one man offered him $5 if he would stay a week. Now, that doesn't sound like much to you, but to get the equivalent value today of money in the mid-19th century, you have to multiply by 25. So he was being offered $125. W.J. Learned gave any minister who would his home and hold meetings $10. That's equivalent of $250. In the summer of 1861, Joseph Bates returned to LaPorte and North Liberty for 4 days of meetings. Well, John Byington preached in the new red brick elementary school in Salem that fall and promised to stay a week in the state where the brethren may appoint the meetings. Following truly refreshing services, he baptized 11 converts, one of whom had walked 10 miles to attend his meetings at this Salem school building, which I've been told by one of your county historians is still standing. In the spring of 1862, Wagner and Moses Hall returned to Roosevelt for some cheering meetings. They shared some of Ellen White's recent testimonies and sold several books and tracts. Meanwhile, over in Cornucopia, isn't that a wonderful name for a town? I have no idea where it is, but I think I'd like to live there. Cornucopia, full of fruit and vegetables. Lovely place, I'm sure. An active layman named Ezra Stiles, as I told you, his name will continue to pop up, gave 9 discourses. They didn't call them sermons yet, and they were usually 2 hours long. Discourses in the schoolhouse there, successfully debating a universalist who made a poor show arguing against the seventh-day Sabbath and the perpetuity of the Ten Commandments. That fall, Bates spent 2 weeks holding meetings in Portage, which resulted in the conversion of 6 souls and the baptism of 1, making 10 Adventists in all in Portage. Bates really loved entering new territory with the gospel. During the winter of 1864 and 5, he held 5 meetings in Lake Station, where he baptized several converts, including O.H. Spencer and his wife, and their 2 12-year-old boys, who came out from the ranks of Satan, as Bates put it. Also in the fall of 1864, Dudley M. Canwright, shown here with his lovely wife Lucretia, gave 21 lectures during a 3-week series in Jackson, rejoicing that prejudice has now turned in our favor after a Methodist minister tried to persuade Canwright's audience of the sacredness of Sunday. But his own church members ridiculed his weak arguments. Isn't that great when you got Sunday keepers on your side? Several weeks later, R.J. Lawrence returned to Jackson for 14 more lectures. South Bend residents heard the third angel's message for the first time when Elder Wagner and W.S. Ingram held tent meetings there in the fall of 1864, converting several listeners, including Eliza Barr. The band soon began holding weekly prayer meetings and Sabbath services. R.J. Lawrence returned to South Bend and North Liberty for 2 weeks of preaching early in January of 65, followed by a visit from John Byington, still battling hoarseness, later that summer. Meanwhile, down in Indianapolis, Sister S.E. Price opened a bed and breakfast at 329 West Market Street, exclusively for Adventists traveling through the area. So there's your first B&B, your first Adventist bed and breakfast in the Indiana state is Sister Price in Indianapolis. She was the only Adventist in the city. She declared, "It would be a great pleasure to see one of like precious faith once in a while to encourage us well in this wicked world." That's the way. You want to see more Adventists, folks? Open a B&B. Open a B&B. Twice she repeated her invitation in the October 24, 1865 and May 8, 1866 Advent Review and Sabbath Herald. As the decade came to a close in 1869, Albert Lane held an extremely successful evangelical series in New London at which 30 attendees converted to Adventism. So popular had Lane become that pastors in local Sunday-keeping churches opened their doors to him, saying, "Occupy as long as you wish." A Methodist pastor in Roosevelt extended a similar invitation, so Sands Lane hurried out from Battle Creek to assist his brother. We will learn a great deal more about the Lane brothers during the 1870s. In fact, Sands Lane became one of your earliest conference presidents. He actually lived in Battle Creek, but he commuted down into the state. Yet spreading the three angels' messages in Indiana was certainly not all peaches and cream, for Adventist evangelists encountered stiff opposition from a number of sources. In 1862, 2 age-to-come ministers, Reverend Shockey and Reverend Walker, staged debates with Elder Wagner regarding a second probation for everybody. the gifts of the Holy Spirit, the heavenly sanctuary, and the law being nailed to the cross at schoolhouses in the cornucopia in Cicero and Wildcat Creek. That same year, Ezra Stiles, there's the name again, earliest lay preacher, debated a Universalist minister at the cornucopia schoolhouse. The latter made a poor show, he said, arguing that Sunday was the true Sabbath and that the law had been nailed to the cross. One of his listeners, a German Dunkard preacher, and there were quite a few Dunkards here in Indiana as well back in the day, told Stiles that he had the truth on both subjects. That is, seventh day was the Sabbath, is the Sabbath, and the law was not nailed to the cross. Another powerful source of opposition was spiritualism. In the state of Indiana, Andrew Jackson Davis edited the spiritualist newspaper, the Herald of Progress, which was received by most spiritualists, especially down in Terre Haute and Portland. Terre Haute was a center of spiritualism in the 19th century. A spiritualist neighbor of Sister M.J. Chapman in Terre Haute confessed to her that Adventist teachings were the greatest barrier to spiritualism that he had found. In 1864, while visiting family in Portland, layman J.A. Luke discovered that spiritualism had taken deep root in that region. So he left Adventist publications behind to counteract its influence. In Fort Wayne, however, where foreign-born Catholic immigrants predominated, Brother D. Hildreth called their beautiful new Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception an idol temple. Surrounded by Catholic neighbors, the Hildreths had to hold their Sabbath gatherings in secret. They were confident, however, that God had not forsaken us. During Elder Canwright's meetings in Jackson, he faced, and I think I'm running ahead of myself, the ad for the meetings. Yeah, the ad for the tent meetings in the Review. He faced particularly virulent opposition from the local Methodists there. They have assailed us, he wrote, regarding the immortality of the soul, denouncing Adventists as heretics and infidels. Canwright successfully debated a Methodist pastor before a packed house and sold a lot of books afterwards. In some cases, individuals who converted to Adventism were kicked out by their own families and expelled from their former churches. That is what happened to the young sister R.A. Wysong when she accepted the Sabbath truth after attending Canwright's meetings. Her parents rejected her new religion and cast her out from their home. Similarly, T. Havens, a young disabled Civil War veteran living at the Soldiers' Home in Knightstown, was expelled along with his mother from the Missionary Baptist Church. He kept the Sabbath despite ridicule and persecution from his military colleagues who considered him an odd case and a fanatic. But he was holding on to the truth, confident, as he put it, my title seems more clear to those mansions in the skies. Thanks to the zealous efforts of Adventist circuit-riding preachers and the courage of the laymen and women mentioned above, in a few places, several tiny companies and 2 churches formed in the 1860s. Now, this is not a church in Indiana, but it's one of the oldest original churches in Michigan, in Charlotte. And it was on the private land of a farmer, and when the Adventists drifted away from the area, the farmer turned it into a chicken coop. But as you can plainly see, it was built to be a church, and it was an Adventist meeting house in the 1860s. So that's what they look like down here in Indiana as well. Well, let's look at the list. Here's the list, a very short one. The first group to sign the covenant, as our pioneers put it, and form a Seventh-day Adventist church were the 20 believers in North Liberty. All right? And they arrived at this railroad station in North Liberty. On August 22 to 24, 1861, they organized themselves as the Seventh-day Adventist Church of North Liberty. Elected church officers formed a Sabbath school, adopted the systematic benevolence plan, and appointed 3 trustees to hold their church property. Frequently, they invited believers from LaPorte to join them for the ordinances of the Lord's house, what we would call communion today. Brother A. Worcester found their worship services very good, saying they strengthened him spiritually. Believers in North Liberty were united and trying to get ready for the coming of the Lord. Apparently, they prospered financially as well. For in 1862, Ezra Stiles asked editor Uriah Smith to send them Moses Hull or some other minister, and Adventist would furnish him a house. Well, J.N. Loughborough was the man they sent. He visited them for a week in 1863, preaching 5 times at 7 meetings and holding communion services with them. R.J. Lawrence returned in 1865 to share 3 discourses, enjoying the blessings of the Lord. Likewise, John Byington in August of 1867 and Joseph Bates in October of 68 spent several days with the believers there. Joseph Bates especially enjoyed resting at James Harvey's quiet, peaceful home in the country. By October of 1868, members in North Liberty had erected the first Adventist meeting house in the state. You can write that down. North Liberty, first Adventist meeting house in Indiana, capable of seating 300 worshipers. It was dedicated on February 27, 1869, free of debt. Elder Elbert Lane, shown here with his lovely wife Ellen, described it as a convenient, neat, and tasty, I think he meant tasteful, house of worship. You don't eat meeting houses. That's what he wrote. He wrote tasty in the review. I'm sure he meant tasteful. Unfortunately, Ellen White's illness at the time prevented her and James from attending the dedication service, as they had planned to do. About a dozen Adventists formed the second church at Salem Center in October of 1861. They too signed the covenant and chose a church leader, probably a male elder. When Byington visited them in the fall of 1864, he found them united and doing well. He baptized 2 more converts into their fellowship. When Bates visited them in the fall of 1866, he rejoiced to find that the converts he had baptized there in 1850 are still holding fast 16 years later. He held 6 meetings with them, including the communion service, and baptized 1 convert. He returned to fellowship with them again in October of 1868. Several other scattered groups, we would call them companies today, gathered for Sabbath services and prayer meetings around the state, and here is the short list. In January of 1860, Ezra Stiles reported that about 6 Adventists met for worship in South Bend, and 18 believers gathered for prayer meetings, although they had no leaders, elders or deacons. Bates met with this little company once a year in 1864, 65, 66, and 68. Byington preached there in 65 and 67. In the summer of 1867, the 18 Adventists in South Bend joined with the 10 believers in nearby Mishawaka for a joint meeting, and this is what Mishawaka used to look like. In December 1864, R.J. Lawrence held meetings with a handful of believers in Jackson Prairie as well. As in the 1850s, however, the prevalent condition for most Adventist believers in the 1860s was one of scattered isolation. W.P. Hale and Sullivan, who had no access to Adventist meetings or Sabbath gatherings, longed to join with other believers for worship in 1860. That same year, Brother L. Adams of Sharpsville begged for messengers, meaning ministers, to come and preach, exhort, and encourage the scattered saints. Ezra Stiles in 1861 even offered $5 if Hull or Loughborough or some other minister would come and reclaim the backslidden ones in North Liberty. Well, C.C. Bodley of Salem promised to pay all the expenses of any Adventist messenger who would come, preach, and baptize 2 converts there. 2 months later, Sister E. Lindsay of Hillsborough, who faced some very severe trials, exclaimed, "I often wish that I could meet with God's people on the Sabbath day." In 1862, as the Civil War claimed thousands of young lives, C. Stewart of Roosevelt declared that the little flock of Sabbath keepers there are still trying to hold on to the precious faith in these times of peril. He pleaded for James and Ellen White to visit them. In December of 1862, in that review, Harriet Hicks of Vigo County told the incredible story of her journey from spiritualism to universalism to atheism, and then her conversion to Seventh-day Adventism after reading every book published by Seventh-day Adventists. And I have a display here at the front you may want to look at later of some of those 1840s, 50s, and 60s books that Hoosier Adventists read. Called a Jew by her neighbors, she longed to meet with other Sabbath keepers and expressed the desire to be baptized by one of the elders if they would come and immerse her. Down in Terre Haute, Sister M.J. Chapman was experiencing similar persecution in 1863 from a spiritualist neighbor whose efforts to undermine her faith she believed came from Satan himself. Up in South Bend, M.B. Odell faced a daily warfare but refused to surrender to Satan as long as I can see my crown ahead. In 1864, J.L. Locke of Salem Center called for John and Catherine Byington, one of our earliest husband and wife preaching teams in Michigan, to come and spend a few days preaching and baptizing among us. Way up north in Fort Wayne, D. Hildreth, surrounded by Catholic immigrants, testified that despite persecution, "I mean to press on," and signed himself, "Yours, striving for the overcomer's crown." In 1865, as the Civil War at last came to a bloody end, Sister R.A. Wysong regretted, "It has been some time since I've been permitted to hear God's people give their testimonies personally." But she enjoyed reading them in the review and asked for believers' prayers that she might remain faithful. Sister G.W. Pierce, the only Adventist in Warsaw, treasured her weekly review. She loved its uncompromising spirit with the powers of darkness and hoped it will ever remain the same faithful monitor of truth. She testified that she was striving to lead a life of self-denial. She hoped for a home with God's dear people in the new earth, but admitted that on this earth, she could sympathize with the lonely ones, because I have not met with anyone of like faith for 2 years. The privilege you have of weekly fellowship. 2 years. I think no one can love the assembly of the saints more than myself. But she encouraged the lonely ones and the pilgrims in the vale of tears to look up. Not long will our Lord delay. As the decade neared its close in 1867, James Pauley of Norway, a tiny village near Monticello, exclaimed, "We have a lonesome time here because the nearest Adventist family lived 40 miles away." He too pleaded for a minister to come and hold meetings. Another self-styled lonely one, Sister C.H. Taffy, encouraged other isolated saints by telling them, "Be not weary in well-doing. God is not lacking concerning his promises." And then she penned the first poem by a Hoosier Adventist printed in the Advent Review and Sabbath Herald. July 9, 1867, page 59, Chaffee's poem, right here on the screen. "Oh, for a faith that will not shrink, though pressed by many a foe, that will not tremble on the brink of poverty or woe, that will not murmur or complain beneath the chastening rod, but in the hour of grief or pain can lean upon its God." That's lovely, isn't it? That's a lovely poem by a Hoosier Adventist. In the September 10, 1867 issue of the Review, former General Conference President John Byington declared, "Brethren, I think Indiana is too much neglected." The Brethren took him seriously and throughout the 1860s began implementing plans and procedures to meet the spiritual needs of the Hoosier members. The first step was taken on October of 1861 in Battle Creek when the Michigan Conference was organized, because at that time the counties in northern Indiana were incorporated into the Michigan Conference, where they would remain for a decade until 1872. The first church voted into conference fellowship was Salem Center, with J.L. Locke and H.L. Doty as Hoosier delegates. 2 months later, the Michigan Conference Committee asked James Harvey to set up a schedule for quarterly meetings across the state. Also in December of '62, David Arnold proposed that a fund be established to meet the financial needs of tent evangelists in Indiana. And so we close. When the General Conference was organized in Battle Creek on May 20, 1863, James Harvey of North Liberty, the first Hoosier delegate, was elected to a 3-man committee to nominate officers for the General Conference. 2 days later at the Michigan Conference session, Harvey also served on a committee to draw up guidelines for congregations to follow in building their meeting houses. When the delegates convened in 1864, the Michigan Conference recognized delegates from Salem Center with 12 members and North Liberty with 11 members. 1 year later, these 2 churches were assigned to the Central District in the Michigan Conference, presided over by former GC President John Byington, who promised to meet with them frequently. This afternoon, we will pick up and finish the 1860s and move into the 1870s. And I hope you can join me. We'll have some new books to show you as well that were published in the 1870s that Hoosier Adventists read. Let's pause for prayer. Loving Lord, as we have rapidly looked at the 1850s and 60s today, we are just stunned at the sacrifices, at the challenges, at the opposition that Adventism faced in those early days. We're so thankful that our pioneer Adventists were faithful. We wouldn't be here without their sacrifices and their sturdy defense of gospel truth. Keep us faithful as well, and may what we learn this week give us a deeper experience in the Lord Jesus Christ until he comes again, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen.